All will be taken off in a minute or so. Okay, good morning. How are you? Thank you for coming out on this gloomy day. So today we're talking about the divinity of Jesus, and we are going to be walking on thin ice, I got to tell you, because it's a loaded topic, and it's been viewed through many different lenses and conceived of in many different ways. The problem is that we tend to simplify things, perhaps too much. So for most average Christians, if you say Messiah, what does that mean? Well, that means God. Okay. Christ, what does that mean? Oh, that means God and divinity. Son of Man, what does that mean? Oh, that means God too. Those things actually mean different things, and so we're going to have to kind of roll up our sleeves and climb into that this morning. I begin here with a story. Years ago, in my first Episcopal church in upstate New York, my pastor was a really wonderful British guy, Father Leslie Prutton. And I still remember this sermon he gave in which he said, "We stand at the foot of the cross, and instead of falling down in worship at the bleeding feet of Christ, we discuss atonement theory." And so we're kind of actually here in this room at 9 o'clock on Sundays to do just that, to discuss atonement theory, because of what's going to go on in there in an hour. We give ourselves this time to discuss the atonement theory so that when we go into the church, we can fall on our knees. So let's get started. The divinity of Jesus. Questions we might consider. Was Jesus divine at all? If he was he always divine? Was he divine at the age of 2? I mean, I've talked to Christians who actually believe that Jesus as a 3-year-old spoke every language, and knew everything. There was a movie, I think it was called The Ruling Class, and Peter O'Toole was was this guy who was kind of deranged, and he thought he was Jesus, and he would walk through the garden and go, "Oh, what a lovely day I've created." So those are all kind of takes on Jesus and his divinity. And we have to kind of dig in there to get to the divinity of Jesus without getting too far into the divinity of Jesus. If something I say rattles you, please let me know. So, let's go. So, to explore the divinity of Jesus, we really need to start out with the Messiah, with his role as Messiah, because we so often conflate all of those terms together. Why did ancient Jews long for a Messiah? What's the whole deal with the Messiah? Where did this notion of Messiah come from? We're going to have to dig into a little history here. Israel had been a great and powerful nation around circa 1000 BC. David was on the throne, yes, the same David that slew Goliath. And Israel was really one of the more powerful countries at that time. The empire of Egypt was already waning, and the empires of Greece and Rome had not come along yet. So Israel was very powerful. We've all heard the stories. David's son Solomon took over the throne. Solomon had 300 wives because all of the tribal leaders and potentates in the eastern Mediterranean wanted an alliance with Israel. And so they married off their daughters to the king, and he was happy to accept more than one. So, and they believed that this was because they were God's chosen nation, and they had the covenant with God. The covenant was, you will be my people, and I will be your God. And as long as they were faithful, they would be maintained in this position of power. Well, that worked great as long as they were this great and powerful and rich nation. But things started happening. They began to, like Egypt, they began to fall from power. And they began to get actually invaded by other countries in the area. They were invaded by the Assyrians and later on the Greeks. In around 550 BC, we had a little thing happening called the Babylonian exile. They were conquered by Babylonia, and Babylonia quickly decided that the Jews were an unruly bunch, and so they exiled all the leadership to Babylon. And we have some beautiful Bible verses about the Babylonian exile. There in the waters of Babylon, we lay down and wept because, it goes on to talk about how we miss Zion. We want to go back. So around this time, the prophets, who were mostly writing in Babylon or starting their message in Babylon, they spoke of how a prophet, a Messiah, would come to restore Israel to glory. And this became a very important motif for the Jews. We are not on top anymore. We're at the, because you got to realize there's a lot of guilt involved. And we all know that Jewish guilt is right up there. I had a Jewish friend who said his mother was the travel agent for the guilt trip. Yeah. So they're looking, because it does. It's not just like, oh well, we need a Messiah. It's like we were at the top. We were strong and powerful because we were keeping the covenant. We were faithful. And now we're not. Now we're getting kicked around by other countries. So it must mean that we failed. We stopped being faithful. So we got to get back on top. And the Messiah is going to do that for us. There were very different opinions of how the Messiah was going to do that, but they really hung all their hopes on the idea that the Messiah will come and bring us back into prominence. But who is the Messiah going to be, and how is the Messiah going to do this? Different groups had different messianic expectations. Some saw a prophet. I never can find the button here. Some thought the Messiah would be a prophet, some an avenging angelic being with a sword, a king, or more specifically, a Davidic king, a king who would follow in David's footsteps. Others looked to the book of Daniel, where Daniel says, I saw one like a son of man coming on the clouds. And finally, some Okay, if you've been watching Spartacus, you know that this is Spartacus, but he really fits the image that they had. The idea that the Messiah would be a man who would raise an army and come and smite Rome. And we're going to talk about those individually. So some wanted a wise but a human king. They did not see this as a role of divinity, who would take the throne of David either by birth or by conquest. And when you read the Bible or when you read the New Testament, you see a lot of references to Jesus as a son of David. And this was an important part of the whole concept of Messiah. He would be a descendant of David. And that's why he was born in Bethlehem, because Bethlehem was the city of David. Some expected an army of avenging angels coming on the clouds, led by a divine angelic Messiah. A lot of Christians today kind of have the same concept that Jesus is going to come back on the clouds with an army of angels. It didn't happen the first time. I suspect that would not be the way Jesus would come back the second time. Many hoped for a strong but human military leader who would raise an army and smite Israel's enemies. This was a very popular choice. A lot of people really were invested in this. In the first century, there were 6 men who put an army together and attacked Rome, claiming to be the Messiah. All of them were captured and crucified. There was one when Jesus was a small boy who would have this would have happened, and Jesus might have actually remembered it. It might have been part of his early education. And I meant to have the name of that guy, and it slipped my mind. One of the more successful ones was Simon Bar Kokhba. And he raised an army and, attacked the Romans. Part of the thing is they didn't have TV. They didn't have news reels. And so they had no idea how big the empire was. Absolutely no idea. So if you're dissatisfied with what's going on, you figure, I'll raise an army, I'll get together 300 or 400 people, and we'll conquer Rome. They just didn't know. Everybody was sure that the Messiah would free Israel from Roman control. This was the central expectation of the Messiah. The Messiah comes to free Israel. But nobody was expecting this Messiah. A Messiah who, whoa. Wrong button, sorry. There we go. A Messiah who would wash his disciples' feet, who would bless and heal people, who would reach out to the poor, who would have a fondness for children and celebrate the Passover with his friends, and allow a woman of the streets to come in and wash his feet. Nobody saw that in their messianic expectation. Yeah, Dick. Dick, I'm going to repeat because this is being recorded. The idea that the Messiah would be another Moses who would reestablish the law. We see that especially in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew really intentionally depicts Jesus as the second Moses. There are lots of instances of how, and you can read books and look it up. There are a lot of parallels between Jesus' ministry and Moses, even down to the story of the slaughter of the innocents in Moses, and then we have the slaughter of the innocents in Jesus' story when both of them were very young, were little boys. Whoops, wrong button again. Okay, Jesus turned their expectations upside down. He did not purposely try to be a new Moses. He didn't try purposely to say, I'm the king, I'm a descendant of David. We don't see, we only hear about him being a descendant of David in the prologues in the birth narratives. He did not lean on that. He didn't go around saying, hey guys, by the way, descendant of David here, in case you're looking for somebody to follow. He was very humble, and I mean, we get that all through the Gospels. He refers to himself repeatedly as the Son of Man. And the Son of Man was a term that referred to like a guy. The Hebrew word for man is Adam, and so it was a son of Adam. And there's also the term Son of God, which he is referred to by, but always by other people. So we see a lot of humility there in Jesus' ministry. Nobody was ready for a humble, self-sacrificing Messiah. Rabbi Hillel in the 2nd century, you all can read. Anybody can't see it? Rabbi Hillel said, he was asked, why does the scripture in one place say that the Messiah will come riding on an ass, and in another place it says that he'll be a glorious king on the Davidic throne? And Rabbi Hillel said, if Israel is faithful, the Messiah will come in glory, but if Israel is faithless, he will be humble and riding on an ass. So we kind of see where Israel came down on that measurement. Jesus seemed so human. When you read the stories, yeah, sure, he performed miracles, he healed the blind, he healed the lame, but that was considered really something, but it was also something that was done by a lot of people in the 1st century in Jerusalem. Even today, you can go to evangelical churches where they claim people are being healed. People go up and get healed. So healing it's a miracle, it's impressive, but it's not going to convince a lot of people that you're the Messiah. And most of what Jesus is doing is very humble service to people. He was questioned by John the Baptist. Are you the one who is to come, or should we look for somebody else? This was the guy who had called him the Lamb of God earlier in his ministry. When he's in jail, he sends a messenger to him and says, is somebody, maybe you're not, maybe I was wrong. Are you the one to come? Thomas doubted him. I won't believe he has risen unless I can put my hand into the wound in his side. Peter denied him 3 times. I always think Thomas gets a bad rap there, Nobody calls him denying Peter, But Thomas is stuck with doubting Thomas throughout history. And the crowd called for his execution. So let's ask ourselves, what does divine mean? Because it's a very loaded term. And as you can see, there are different kind of images that we associate with divine. What does divine mean to the ancient Greeks and Romans? Because this is a really important question, because most of the people who were joining the early church in the first 3 centuries were Greeks and Romans. There were not a lot of devout Jews joining the church. In the very beginning, like 1st century maybe, but really within a fairly short time, certainly by around 100, 150, there had been a break between the Jews and the Christians. For a little while, Christianity was kind of viewed as a sect within Judaism, but fairly quickly they broke apart. And from that point on, mostly Greeks were joining the church. What did divine mean to the ancient Jews? That'll be very important for us. And what does it mean to us? What does divine mean to you? So, to the ancient and polytheistic Greco-Romans, their view of godness, deity, divinity was very, very different from ours. We tend to have a very high bar on what's divine. You know, it has to have all the superlatives. You know, omniscient, omnipotent, immutable, whatever. So to the ancient Greeks and Romans, a divine being would look like a human, but with superpowers. More like the Marvel universe than our society. A divine person would probably live on Mount Olympus, but not always. They would be eternal. They would probably have a beginning. The gods of ancient Greece, most of them were born. They came out. They came from the Titans. Blah blah blah, and they would be eternal, but only after they were born. They were capable of anger and jealousy and lust. We've all heard the stories about Zeus. He was kind of a randy kind of guy. And some of the others were too. They had to be placated. You had to be careful to go to the temples and placate not just one god, but a whole bunch of gods, because if they have a problem with you, it's not going to go well for you. You might get turned into a tree, or something bad will happen. And then there were some who were semi-divine, or demigods. These usually resulted when one of the main gods had a relationship with a human. And then we like really lower the bar, because then by the 1st century, and we're talking about Jesus in the 1st century, by the 1st century, the emperors have declared themselves gods. So if you say to somebody in Greece in the 1st century, I think that person is divine, they're going to be like, really? Yeah, that's cool. Unlike us today, we have changed our notion. So what did divine mean to ancient Jews? There is one God, only one God who is divine. The Shema is the prayer that all devout Jews are supposed to say every morning and every night. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. They were really, really sticklers about this one God business. Their God was omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, eternal. The Jewish God, and I know some of you will argue with me on this, exists in time. You get a sense in reading the Old Testament that this is not a God who is outside of time. He seems to learn and change his mind. He destroys the earth with a flood, and then looks at it and says, yeah, next time I'm going to do it different. Next time it'll be fire. Well, this implies that when he was thinking about doing the flood, he was not aware that it was not going to work well. So you get the idea of a God who learns. He is changeable in the sense that he changes his mind and decides to do things a little differently. I mean, we also have the story of Lot, and God comes to Lot and says, I'm going to destroy Sodom because Sodom is a very evil city. And Lot says, oh, come on, you can't destroy the whole city. How about if I found 100 faithful people? And God's like, all right. How about 50? Would you do it? Would you save the city for 50? And God's like, all right, yeah, you're driving a hard bargain. Well, Lot was a very good at bartering, and he got down to 10. But this implies that God make some changes in his approach. Now, you might argue with me and say, yeah, but he knew he was going to argue. He knew Lot was going to want to barter, and he knew where it was going to end up. That's very possible, I suppose. And also, he is caring and compassionate. He cares about the people, but he has no physical form. To this day, if you go into a synagogue, unless it's a really open-minded synagogue, you do not see images of God. When Moses was up on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments, the people were sitting around and go, hey, let's melt all our gold and make an image so we can have something to focus our worship on. How cool would that be? What are we going to make? I don't know. How about a chicken? No, let's do a calf. And Moses comes down and is furious. How dare you create a graven image of God? What did divine mean to ancient Greek philosophers? Well, number one, why is this even important? It's important because by around 300 AD, the church is pretty much being ruled and led by educated Greeks. And if you were an educated Greek, you were educated in philosophy. Education was philosophy. You didn't get like courses in shop, or anything like that. You just followed, you followed a philosopher around and learned. Okay, the philosophers had come to the conclusion that the Greek pantheon didn't exist. It was all just fiction, all the Greek gods and goddesses. God is for them the supreme intelligence of the universe. Very abstract, possesses all the superlatives: omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence. He is eternal and unchanging. Now, see how we're evolving away from the Greek pantheon idea that you had all these gods sitting up on top of Mount Olympus. He is pure reason. He's pure truth. And he is not personal. The God of the Greek philosophers doesn't interact with you, doesn't care necessarily about you except in a very abstract sense. So much diversity of thought, so many ways to see the divine. How can Jesus possibly meet all these expectations? And you can see how different the divinity of the Greeks was compared to the divinity of the Jews and compared to the philosophers. And if you kind of think about it, and you think about our idea of divinity, we've kind of got a smorgasbord of all of it. We don't believe that our God lives on Mount Olympus, but a lot of Christians kind of see God sitting on the clouds, and it's very Zeus-like, We tend to think of God as having a physical form, an old man with a white beard, and And as an old man with a white beard, I can tell you there's nothing deifying about that. Some theologians assert that Jesus never declared himself divine. It was his disciples who saw the face of God in him. Now, we can argue about that, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Certainly, Jesus didn't ever just, as far as we know in the Gospels, didn't ever just stand up and say, hey, by the way, I'm divine, everybody. I'm the Son of God. I am not only the Messiah, but I am the divine Messiah. He never said that. And in fact, he seemed to kind of shush people when they tried to proclaim him, either the Messiah or the Son of God. In Mark, we have this thing called the Messianic secret. He heals somebody and they go, wow, you've healed me. This is incredible. And he says, don't tell anybody. Over and over, don't tell anybody what I did. So we're trying to kind of hone in on the idea of the divinity of Jesus. And next week we're going to talk about different theories about Jesus' divinity. If Jesus is divine, how is he divine? Did he become divine at some point? Did he become divine after he was born? Was he divine at his birth? Was he divine eternally before his birth? The Bible can be seen in a lot of ways in this topic and in this concept. We're going to dive in next week and talk about the different ways that people have kind of defined the divinity of Jesus. The problem is that for us today, we're kind of we're open-minded and yet hard-nosed about it. We kind of see divinity as this, you have to have all the superlatives, but at the same time, we kind of resist the idea of a person having all the superlatives of divinity. On the one hand, we're kind of like, well, of course, yeah, he couldn't have been God. And on the other hand, we really want him to be God. And we were kind of brought up with the idea of Jesus as God. But we're going to talk about this. Was Jesus God in the cradle? Was Jesus God at his baptism? Was Jesus God at his resurrection? Was Jesus God from the beginning of time? We've got a couple of minutes. Comments, questions, thoughts? Yeah, Wayne.
So actually, it's always going to be a conundrum because on the one hand, it models extreme humility. If you're extremely humble, you can't describe yourself in a lot of superlatives.
Okay, good point. On the one hand, Jesus is very humble, but if you're being very humble, you can't describe yourself as God. And so some people say, well, he gave clues, it was all, you had to really be paying attention. And like you say, it's a conundrum. It's a very interesting thing for us, as we discuss atonement theories, to look into that. The reality is that whether he declared himself God or not, his followers did. His followers saw in him the face of God. And not only the people who knew him and lived down the street from him when he was in Capernaum, but people who didn't even find out about him until 20, 30, 40, 50 years after his crucifixion. These people joined up. They saw God. They were willing to die for that. And so, yeah, it's a conundrum, and it comes down to where you are beginning in your quest for Jesus' deity. If you don't believe in God, you're not going to believe that Jesus is divine. You kind of have to believe in God. On the other hand, I think for some people, Jesus is a doorway into believing for God, believing in God. Anybody else? Yes?
You started with atonement theology. Could you look back to that for just a second?
Well, I started there because just that was what Reverend Prutton said. He could have said, instead of we discuss atonement theories, we discuss theories of divinity, we discuss theories of anything. It was just a random choice because that was what he said, and it affected me so deeply that 40 years later I remember it very well, and I almost am brought to tears every time I tell that story. So, if you're interested in doing atonement theories, we can do that, but it was just a kind of a random choice. Yeah?
In the, pardon me offending anybody, but I'm going to do it anyway, the Make Israel Great Again idea for the Messiah, was there anything that we, the people, had to do to become worthy of it, or do we just go on living exactly as we live, doing exactly as we want, and here this Messiah comes to rescue us?
Wow, really good question. Let me see if I can, if I get what you're asking. For the Jews in the first century, were they required to do anything to assist the Messiah or to be worthy for the Messiah to come? I am sure that was discussed and many people felt that way. The general response is the Messiah will not come until we are pure, until we are devout, until we're the Jewish leaders are constantly calling people back to a purer faith. There are places in the prophets where they're saying, like, look at you, you're supposed to be Israel, you're supposed to be the devout country, and look at you, you're sacrificing to idols, you're having these weird parties. The big defilement is you're hanging out with Romans, you're starting to wear togas instead of the traditional Jewish garb, you're going over to their temples sometimes. You can't do that. You can't have anything to do with the Romans or the Roman religion. And God will not save us. He will not send us a Messiah until we shape up. But then, it leads to the question, so if the Messiah shows up and you believe somebody's a Messiah, what's your responsibility? For some, it'll be like, I'm going to get a sword and join the army. Again, people, Simon Zelotes was like, come on, Jesus, let's get an army up. The people love you. You've got a bunch of people getting together who, like when you give a speech, a lot of people show up. As Andrew Lloyd Webber says in Jesus Christ Superstar, keep on yelling their devotion, but add a touch of hate at Rome. You'll rise to a greater power. Jesus refused to say, I'm the king, make me the king, put me on the throne. Dick.
For Jews who picture the Messiah as another Moses, you remember their experience with Moses was 40 years in the wilderness on their way to the covenant promise of a land filled with milk and honey. So there was a lot of having to be worthy, having to identify the Messiah, having to go through trials and tribulations and be faithful in order to get to the covenant promise.
Was that a question or a comment? Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, and once the Gospels were being written, What I think happened is that years went by, that everybody was expecting Jesus to return imminently. Paul says, don't get married. There's nothing wrong with getting married, but we don't have time to get married and have kids because Jesus is coming back and we have got to get people signed up. We got to get people to be part of the group that's going to be saved. There was that urgency in the early church. And then I think time passed and suddenly it's like, oh, some of the witnesses, some of the apostles are starting to die off. The people who were there, who can tell this story, are dying off. We need to get this written down. And that kind of, because I always wondered, why did they wait 30 years, 40 years, 50 years to write the Gospels? And I think that's the reason, because, and I have proof, the same thing happened with the Holocaust. You didn't see people writing about the Holocaust. And then in about the 1980s and 90s, they realized all the people who were in the camps who survived are dying. And actually that's what Steven Spielberg said was the impetus for him to start the Shoah Project, was that the witnesses are dying. We have to get their stories written down. And I think that's what happened in the early church. But it's interesting, and we can do this, but it's interesting to look at the four Gospels and look at what are they really saying. Matthew is clearly drawing, as Dick said, clearly drawing parallels between Moses and Jesus, so that Jesus is sort of the new Moses. St. Paul occasionally refers to him as the second Adam or the new Adam. And what does that mean? In what way was Jesus the second Adam? And so, and then Luke kind of tells the whole story from the women's point of view. You hear a lot of Mary's story, Mary, his mother's story, and then you also hear some stories from the other women like Mary Magdalene. John is just like very poetic and very hard to kind of grip. The stories of Jesus' death on the cross go from Mark, who has Jesus screaming out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" to John, who's on the other end of the spectrum, who shows Jesus being majestic on the cross. He's having a conversation with the Apostle John and telling him to take care of Mary, his mother. His last words, he bows his head and says, it is done. So we have very different angles and images of Jesus in his ministry and in his crucifixion. We got to get going, but thank you so much for coming. Please come back next week. I'll be devastated if you don't.